They say a mountain man once lived 20 winters without a woman's voice in his cabin, his heart buried with the wife he lost. Folks called him cursed, dangerous, untouched by tenderness. But then came a storm, and with it, a young widow, desperate, hunted, clutching a child who knocked on his door. What drove her to his ridge? What secret did she carry in her satchel? And what pain was he still hiding in his cellar? In a land ruled by cruelty and silence, could two broken souls find something as rare as love or as powerful as redemption? When a widow knocks and a forgotten man answers, the mountains remember what mercy feels like. But tell me this, who truly found shelter that day, and who had been waiting all along? Every time I read your comments, I see the thread of decency that still ties us together across hills, highways, and heartaches. If you believe in stories that honor resilience, redemption, and the quiet power of doing right, then you're already part of our circle. Let me know which state you're watching from, and be sure to like, subscribe, and share so these stories keep riding on. The wind tore at Clara Bell's bonnet like a clawed hand, shrieking through the frozen pines as if warning her to turn back. Snowflakes fell in wild spirals, stinging her cheeks and blinding her path. She kept her arms tight around the bundle beneath her coat, where the faint breath of her baby warmed her breast like a flickering ember. Her boots, soaked through and cracking, sank into the drift with every desperate step. Behind her, the trail was already vanishing. Before her, nothing but the hush of snow and the beating of her heart like a drum of dread. She didn't know how many miles she'd come since sundown. The sky had darkened too quickly, and now the forest stretched wide and white, full of ghosts. But Clara hadn't come this far to die in the woods. She pressed forward, muttering prayers under her breath, half to God, half to the baby. Just a little farther, Ben. Just a little more, sweetheart. Her voice cracked in the wind, raw from cold and silence. Then, through the wall of falling snow, she saw it, a thin column of smoke, rising crooked through the trees like a lifted finger, pointing her fate. It wasn't close, but it was real. A fire meant life, shelter, hope, and maybe, if heaven still had mercy left, safety. Her knees buckled as she started toward it. Every step now felt like lifting lead, but her grip on the child never loosened. The trees parted onto a rocky ridge, the snow thinner here where the wind blew harsher. She nearly cried out at the sight of the cabin, rough-hewn, dark, silent, the roof sagging under snow but standing firm. Smoke curled from its chimney. A lantern glowed dimly behind a frost-bitten window pane. She hesitated. They'd warned her in Hollow Creek not to come this way. Said he lived alone up here, a man with a beard like a bear's and eyes like gun barrels. They said he'd killed once, maybe twice, that he hadn't spoken to a soul in 20 years. Ain't no wife ever warmed his bed, the barkeep had said, smirking. He sleeps beside ghosts. But Clara knew what she'd left behind, and she knew evil didn't always come in beards and flintlocks. Sometimes it wore polished boots and carried deeds sealed with wax. She climbed the 3 wooden steps and knocked. The sound of her knuckles against the door echoed in her ears louder than any gunshot. The wind stopped, just for a second, as if listening. Nothing. She knocked again, weaker this time. Her legs were trembling. Then came the sound, a creak of boots against wooden floor, slow, deliberate. A shadow passed behind the thin window. A latch scraped. The door opened. He stood there like a statue carved from timber, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, wrapped in a coat of fur and silence. Snow caught in the lines of his beard, which matched the frost in his gaze. His expression gave away nothing, no welcome, no suspicion, only stillness, the kind of stillness that comes after too many winters and too many losses. Clara met his eyes. She couldn't speak. She just held out the baby. He looked at her, then at the child. A breath passed between them, full of unsaid things. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, and Clara Bell crossed the threshold into the unknown. Inside the cabin, the heat struck her like a soft hammer, loosening the stiffness in her limbs even as her knees threatened to give out. The door shut behind her with a dull thud, sealing out the storm. The room smelled of pine smoke, old leather, and something stewed low and slow on a cast-iron stove. Shadows clung to the corners, but the firelight spread wide enough to make out the bare essentials: a rough table, a pair of wooden chairs, a cot made of cedar planks, and the kind of stillness that hadn't known another voice in years. Clara didn't speak. Neither did he. The man, this hulking stranger, whose presence filled the room like a thundercloud, strode past her with quiet purpose. He stirred the fire with a blackened poker, sending up a storm of sparks. Then, without looking her way, he reached for a woolen blanket draped over the back of a chair and held it out. She took it with shaking hands, murmuring the first word since she'd stepped inside. "Thank you." He only gave a slow nod. She sat down stiffly near the hearth, unwrapping the baby just enough to let some warmth seep in. The child stirred, let out a small sigh, and nestled deeper against her chest. Clara rocked slightly, instinct more than thought. The man disappeared into a back room and returned with a small tin cup of water. He set it beside her without comment, then knelt to add another log to the flames. When he looked up, their eyes met fully for the first time. His face was rough-hewn like the cabin itself, deep lines, thick brows, nose slightly crooked as if it had met fists in younger days. Snow still clung to his beard, melting in small drops. But it was his eyes that held her. Not cruel, not cold, just empty. Hollow like a mine, long abandoned, but still dangerous if you wandered too deep. He spoke at last. One word, gruff and low. "Elias." She blinked, unsure she'd heard him. His gaze flicked toward her, waiting. Clara," she replied. "Clara Bell." He nodded once more. Then he turned, moved to the corner, and lifted a cast-iron kettle off the stove. He poured 2 cups. One he kept. The other he placed near her, within reach, but not too close. It was like watching a wild animal perform a ritual, a sequence of offerings, done not for show, but from some unspoken code. They sat like that for a long while. The fire crackled. The wind outside howled against the logs, but in here time slowed to something ancient. Clara could feel her hands again. Her cheeks stung as they thawed. Her baby breathed steady and slow. She looked around the space. It was sparse, but not cruel. There were no trophies on the wall, no rifles left carelessly out. Just a shelf of books, a pair of boots by the door, a coat hung with care on a carved wooden peg. Everything had its place, even the silence. Elias took a slow sip of his drink and stared into the flames. He hadn't asked her why she was here. He hadn't asked who the child belonged to. He hadn't asked anything at all. Clara felt the tight grip in her chest loosen, just slightly. No suspicion, no questions, just a place by the fire, a blanket, and a man who hadn't smiled in a very long time. She wrapped the baby tighter and leaned her head back against the log wall. The snowstorm could rage all it wanted. Tonight, they were safe. The snow had settled thick over Hollow Creek by dawn, laying a clean white hush across the crooked streets and soot-stained windows. But peace was only an illusion. Beneath that blanket of frost, words burned hotter than any hearth. She took her baby and disappeared, spat Jeremiah Lorne, the saloon keeper, slamming down a chipped mug on the bar top. Didn't even take her trunk, just up and vanished like smoke. His voice carried through the half-empty room, drawing nods from men hunched over their morning whiskeys. "Mark my words, she's gone feral. And y'all know where feral women go." He tilted his head toward the ridge above the tree line, where the horizon broke jagged against the sky. Up to him, a clatter of spoon against saucer echoed from the corner. "With that man?" hissed Mrs. Channing, the preacher's wife, her gloved hands clutching her collar, as if the mere mention of the mountain man might summon sin through the window. "That beast? I heard he speaks to no one, lives with bones under his floorboards. They say he watches the town through a spyglass, just waiting for a girl to wander too far." A silence followed, thick with unease and imagination. It spread like smoke from a smoldering fire. "You know what else I heard?" added old F. Burnley, leaning forward with roamy eyes. "That he ain't never laid with a woman. 20 years and not a one. They say he's cursed. Or crazy," someone muttered. But in the far corner of the mercantile, behind a stack of flannel shawls and hand-stitched quilts, Maudie Ray listened without blinking. She didn't speak much in these gatherings, didn't see the use in shouting over fools, but today The bitterness in her belly rose faster than her tea could cool. She stood slowly, drawing all eyes. The room fell still as she walked to the center, her cane thudding softly against the wood floor. The years had curved her back, but hadn't dulled her gaze. She looked from face to face, pausing at Jeremiah, then at the preacher's wife. "You all gossip like hens," she said finally, voice calm as a sermon but sharp enough to shave pride. "And not one of you's asked why Clara Bell was runnin' in the first place." Mrs. Channing opened her mouth, but Maudie raised a hand. "She came into my home 2 nights ago, eyes swollen, bruises like thumbprints on her neck, held that baby like she was holdin' the last piece of her soul." Maudie's voice cracked, just for a heartbeat. "She didn't need a prayer. She needed a place no man could reach her." Jeremiah scoffed. "So you sent her to the devil himself?" Maudie turned, slow and deliberate. "If the devil keeps a fire going and his hands to himself, maybe he ain't the devil after all. Maybe the real monsters wear boots and smiles and ride down from the valley with papers in their pockets." No one spoke. She reached into her coat and pulled out a slip of parchment, then held it up so all could see a torn corner of a forged marriage certificate, the ink smeared by tears. Clara Bell was never that man's wife, but she was his possession in his mind, and he meant to take her back. So yes, I told her to go to the ridge, to the man you call a monster. Maudie lowered the paper. Her voice softened, not with weakness, but with weariness. Sometimes safety doesn't come from saints. Sometimes it comes from the ones who've known real hurt and wouldn't wish it on another soul. She turned and walked out into the cold, leaving only the hush of truth behind her. And from that day forward, Whispers in Hollow Creek didn't just speak of the widow's flight. They spoke of what it might mean that she ran auto to the mountain, and whether maybe, just maybe, there was more to the man on Echo Ridge than any of them dared to believe. The days passed not in hours but in rituals. Each morning, as the frost still clung to the window panes like lace, Clara woke to the soft scrape of boots across the floor. Elias Boone never knocked. He simply entered the room with a loaf of coarse bread, steam rising faintly from its broken crust, and set it quietly on the table near the hearth. Sometimes he left a chunk of cheese. Sometimes a jar of jam, sealed tight with wax and string. Always bread, always silence. Clara would sit up slowly, her back aching from the thin straw mattress, and lift Benjamin from the nest of blankets beside her. She would eat in pieces, small bites between soothing the baby's whimpers, her mind still half in the world she had fled. The bread grounded her. It was not soft, it was not sweet, but it was real. It filled her and warmed her, and it came without question or cost. Elias would already be outside by then, splitting logs with a rhythm so steady it became a kind of heartbeat in the distance. Clara watched from the window sometimes, not because she was drawn to the sight of him, but because it anchored her. His movements were deliberate, measured, no violence in his swing, no fury in his muscles, just the steady work of a man who had made peace with being alone, until now. He didn't ask her why she didn't speak. He didn't press her for names or origins. He didn't even glance at the bruises fading slow beneath the fabric of her sleeves. And because of that terrible, comforting silence, Clara began to breathe again. Benjamin was the first to break it. On the third morning, as she sat rocking him by the fire, feeding him crumbs of dry bread soaked in warm milk, he let out a sound she hadn't heard in weeks, a giggle, pure and round and small, but alive. She froze. The spoon trembled in her hand. Elias looked up from across the room, where he had been sharpening a blade at the workbench. His face didn't change. He didn't smile, but he paused, just for a moment. Then he returned to his whetstone with a sound so soft it nearly matched the child's laughter. That night Clara laid awake longer than usual, the cabin dim except for the low glow of embers. She could hear Elias outside, pacing slow along the porch, perhaps listening, perhaps keeping watch. The wind howled through the pines, but the walls held strong. Inside, she wrapped the baby in both arms and whispered against his hair. "We're not ghosts yet," she murmured. "We're still here." The next morning, Elias brought the bread, as always. But this time, there was a tin cup of tea beside it, strong and bitter-smelling, but thoughtfully left with a wedge of lemon. Clara stared at it, and for the first time, looked up as he turned to go. "Thank you," she said softly. He stopped, nodded once, then stepped back into the snow, his footsteps fading into the woods, steady as ever. In the battered cabin on the ridge, something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite hope began to grow in the silence between a woman who had been broken and a man who had long ago stopped expecting anything at all. The bruises bloomed in fading hues along Clara's arms, yellow turning to green, green to the pale shade of healing. Some were shaped like hands, fingers pressed too hard into fragile flesh. Others were blunt and spreading, reminders of doors slammed, walls struck, promises broken in the dark. These were not marks left by the forest or the frost. They were made by the man she had fled. A man who called himself husband with one voice and jailer with another. Clara had not spoken his name in weeks. She refused to give it power. Instead, she wrote it once on the first page of the worn, weather-stained journal she found tucked at the bottom of her satchel. Then she crossed it out with a heavy line. Beneath it, she wrote one word, free. Each morning, after feeding Benjamin and folding the blanket back into its corner, she sat by the window while the baby napped and opened the book on her lap. The ink ran thin from the old pen, scratching across the page in broken lines, but she kept writing, not for anyone else, just to remember who she had been before fear took her name. The journal became a map, not of places, but of wounds. She drew sketches of her old room, the cracked ceiling, the iron latch on the inside of the door he'd nailed shut. She wrote the names of flowers she used to press into the church hymnal. She listed everything she could still feel, the smell of the orchard at dusk, the sound of her mother humming, the warmth of her baby's breath when he nestled beneath her chin. These became her inventory of survival. Elias never interrupted. He passed her where she sat each day, his boots soft on the floorboards, sometimes carrying firewood, sometimes polishing old tools or sorting through a box of bent nails. If he noticed the journal open across her knees, he gave no sign. But one morning, she returned from washing linens at the stream and found her journal moved ever so slightly, exactly where she left it, but the page was flatter, as though it had been lifted and carefully closed, and beside it, without a note, lay a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a new ink pen, not fancy, not expensive, but whole. The nib was smooth, the weight familiar, a gift not of indulgence, but of understanding. Clara stared at it for a long time, the cold water dripping from her sleeves, her heart quiet in her chest. It was the kind of gesture that asked nothing, offered everything, and spoke louder than any apology or question ever could. He had seen her bruises. He had seen her pain. And instead of asking her to explain herself, instead of reaching into her story, he had simply laid a tool at her side, an offering of respect, a whisper of solidarity. That night, after Benjamin had fallen asleep, she sat beside the hearth and wrote again. Not memories, not pain. She wrote, today. She described the way the snow melted in lines across the roof, the sound of Elias splitting logs in rhythm with her heartbeat, the weight of a pen that felt like permission. Then, on a clean page, in small cursive lines, she wrote, there is kindness here, quiet as snowfall, but it stays. And beneath that, I think he sees me. I think he knows what it means to be left behind. She closed the journal and smiled, not broadly, not fully, but enough to remind her lips what the shape of hope felt like. The wind had calmed by late afternoon, but the cold clung to the ridge with stubborn teeth. Clara stood by the small window, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea gone lukewarm, watching the slow drift of clouds roll across the gray sky. Benjamin napped in his cradle near the hearth, cheeks flushed pink with warmth, and the cabin had settled into one of those rare, hushed moments that felt almost like peace. The fire crackled. A log popped. Somewhere outside, a raven called once and went silent. Then she heard it. A sharp, panicked bleat tore through the stillness, high-pitched, desperate. Another followed, and then the rapid shuffle of hooves against packed snow and frozen dirt. The goats. Clara's body went tense, her eyes darting toward the door. She moved quickly to the window, pressing her face to the glass. Just beyond the clearing, near the brush where the edge of the woods dipped low, something moved. It was fast, low to the ground, weaving through the snow like a shadow with teeth. Coyote. She saw the flash of its coat, a mottled gray streak, lean with hunger and bold with winter's desperation. The goats were clustered in a tight knot near the old stump, bleating wildly. One was limping, its back leg dragged at a strange angle. The coyote circled, slow now, calculating. Clara's hand rose to her mouth. The door swung open without warning. Elias stepped out into the snow, coat unbuttoned, his long rifle already in his hands. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He moved with purpose, measured, calm, the way a man moves when he knows the land and the beasts upon it. She watched from the window, heart pounding. Elias raised the rifle and took a long breath. The coyote hadn't noticed him yet. It crept closer to the wounded goat, body low, tongue flicking out between yellow teeth. One step, then another. And just as it gathered its legs to leap, the rifle cracked. Clara flinched. The baby stirred behind her, but did not wake. Outside, the coyote collapsed mid-lunge, its body skidding to a stop in the snow. The other goats scattered, then regrouped near the shed, trembling but unharmed. Elias walked to the carcass, crouched beside it. He didn't gloat, he didn't spit or mutter curses. He bowed his head slightly, as though offering some silent recognition between hunter and hunted. Then he lifted the animal gently by its scruff and carried it toward the tree line. She watched as he disappeared behind the trees, re-emerging minutes later with the same steady pace. When he returned to the cabin, he paused at the door and met her eyes through the glass. There was no pride in his face, no demand for praise or thanks, only a quiet certainty, like he'd done what needed doing, no more and no less. Clara stepped back as he entered. He brushed the snow from his boots, set the rifle on its rack, and moved toward the fire to warm his hands. Neither of them spoke. But in that silence, something shifted. He had killed, yes, but not like him, not out of rage or sport or control. Elias had ended a threat to protect what was his, to guard not out of ownership, but out of duty, out of honor. Clara looked down at Benjamin sleeping peacefully, then back at Elias, who now sat in the worn chair near the hearth, his eyes half-lidded, his body still as stone, and for the first time she felt something stronger than fear begin to stir in her chest. She was not just safe here. She was crossover. The wind had quieted by evening, leaving only the soft creak of the pines and the distant call of a night bird echoing through the hollows. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped gently, casting gold light across the rough walls and bathing the room in a warmth that did not reach the silence stretching between them. Elias sat in his usual place, one hand curled around a tin cup, the other resting loosely on his knee. Clara, near the hearth with Benjamin in her arms, stared into the flames as though trying to read something written in the shifting light. The child had drifted to sleep after a day of fussy teething, and now he lay heavy in her arms, warm and trusting. She rocked him absent-mindedly, her own breath shallow and slow. The pen and journal rested untouched on the table beside her, pages fluttering faintly with each draft from the chimney. The words hadn't come today, or the day before. There had been peace, yes, enough to breathe, enough to heal a little, but not enough to forget, not enough to trust that what she had left behind wouldn't come clawing up the mountain to find her. Her eyes didn't leave the fire as she spoke. "He'll come looking for me." The words were quiet, but they cut the air like a blade. Elias didn't move, didn't flinch. Only the barest shift of his jaw told her he'd heard. She waited for the silence to swallow her words, to make her doubt she'd even spoken them aloud. But then he answered, "Let him try." 2. His voice was flat, not cruel, but final, like a gate closing, the kind of sentence that needed no elaboration. Clara turned her head slowly, studying the way the firelight played across the lines of his face. There was no pity in his expression, no fear, only the steel of a man who had faced darkness before and had chosen not to be ruled by it again. She looked back down at Benjamin, brushing her fingers gently across his brow. He's not the kind of man who stops, not because of a storm, not because of a child, not even because he's got no right. Elias set his cup on the floor beside his boot. Then he's a fool. Clara's lips parted, but no more words came. She wanted to explain, to spill the full truth of what that man had done, how he'd cornered her, threatened her with law papers and money and power, how he'd promised that the baby would belong to him, that she would be nothing more than a shadow in his house, a name erased from her own life. But the words caught in her throat, brittle with shame. Instead, she said, "I used to pray he'd vanish, that I'd wake up one morning and it would all be gone. But I stopped praying the night he struck Benjamin. That was when I knew I had to run." Elias's gaze didn't falter. "You did right." She let out a shaky breath, tears stinging her eyes, but not falling. "I don't want to run anymore." "You won't." There was no promise in his tone, no poetry, no pretense, just the truth of a man who had lost too much to stand by and lose again. Clara looked into the fire once more, and for the first time since she'd fled that valley in the dead of night, the weight on her chest loosened. Not gone, but bearable. She whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure he heard. But when she rose to lay Benjamin in the cradle and turned to stoke the fire, she saw it. Elias, still seated, watching the flames, his eyes hard and steady. And just for a moment, she knew he was already building walls, quiet, invisible, made not of timber or stone, but of something stronger. Resolve, vows unspoken, a promise written in silence and firelight. He would not let her be taken. Not now. Not ever. The storm rolled in slow, the kind that doesn't shout its arrival but murmurs it in the hush of animals and the restless sway of the trees. That morning, the birdsong had gone quiet, and even Benjamin stirred uneasily in his cradle, fussing without cause. Elias had left before dawn to check the traps down near Willow Pass, leaving Clara alone in the cabin with only the child, the wind, and the ticking silence of old wood settling. She'd meant to clean. Nothing more. A small gesture of gratitude, maybe. She had swept the floor, beat out the blankets, stacked the kindling. Then, on impulse, she moved toward the tall chest, near the corner an old thing made of cedar, its surface rough with time and nicks from use. She wasn't snooping, not truly, just straightening, dusting, making space. The drawer stuck for a moment before it gave way with a creak. Inside were folded shirts, worn soft and thin, a few tools, a cloth pouch sealed with a button, and beneath that something small, almost hidden in the seam between two boards. Clara reached down and lifted it. A ring. It was simple, delicate, and bent slightly out of shape, the gold dulled by years, the band thin as a whisper, no stone, no inscription, just a woman's ring, forgotten in the dark. Clara turned it over in her fingers. It was too small to be Elias's. It had belonged to someone else, someone whose presence still lived in the grain of the walls and the hush of his voice. She could feel it as surely as breath on her neck, the way he moved around certain corners of the cabin, the way his eyes lingered on the weeping pine outside the window when he thought no one noticed. She held the ring in her palm, motionless, as if it might speak. She didn't need to ask. The truth was woven into the silence he wore like a second skin. Still, when the door opened and Elias stepped inside, shoulders dusted with fresh snow, their eyes met and the air changed. He saw the ring in her hand. His step paused, just for a moment. His eyes dropped to it, then back to hers. And then the silence between them grew heavy, not hostile, but full, crowded with memories, with things unsaid and things that would never be spoken. A storm passed between them, not of words, but of knowing. The kind of knowing that respects pain by not forcing it to speak its name. Clara didn't ask. She simply nodded, once, and gently placed the ring back into the drawer where it had waited all these years. She closed it with care, her fingertips trembling slightly as they left the wood. Elias said nothing, only moved to the fire and began removing his gloves with slow, steady motions. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. Later, as the snow began to fall heavier, he laid an extra log on the fire and set a pot of stew to warm on the stove. Clara moved around him quietly, the child on her hip, and for the rest of that day, they did not speak of what had passed between them. They didn't need to. It had not broken what they were building, but it had reminded them both that sorrow lived here, too buried deep, not forgotten, only waiting. That night, long after the baby had fallen asleep and the fire had dimmed to embers, Clara lay awake and listened to the wind against the cabin walls. Her thoughts circled the ring, the drawer, the grief in Elias's eyes, and she understood something she hadn't before. He wasn't afraid of loss. He lived with it every day. But love, that was something else entirely. That was what had been buried. And that, perhaps, was what scared him most of all. The night pressed close around the cabin, thick and unmoving, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. A full moon hung low over Echo Ridge, casting a pale glow across the snow-covered trees and sending silver light trickling through the frost-laced window panes. Inside, the fire had burned low, its warmth lingering in waves as the last embers pulsed like a fading heartbeat. Benjamin slept soundly in his cradle, cheeks round and flushed, wrapped in quilts Clara had repaired stitch by stitch. Elias sat in his chair near the hearth, his shoulders hunched, hands folded, not working, not resting, just existing in the quiet. Clara had grown used to his silence by now. It wasn't empty. It wasn't cruel. It was the silence of a man who carried too much and trusted too little to let it spill. But something about the night felt different. He hadn't touched the stew she'd left for him, hadn't looked her in the eye when she'd laid Benjamin down. His stillness tonight felt brittle, as though even a breath might break it. Clara moved slowly, quietly, taking her seat near the fire with her mending in hand, though the needle barely moved. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She waited, and in time, Elias began. "It was a night like this," he said, voice low, rasped like wind through pines. Snow so deep the fence posts disappeared, cold enough to freeze breath to your beard before it left your mouth. Clara glanced up. His eyes were fixed on the fire, distant, unfocused. "She went into labor early. A month, maybe more. I rode for the doctor, but his wagon couldn't make it up the ridge. By the time I got back, she was already screaming. I did what I could." He swallowed hard, and Clara saw the way his hands clenched, the white in his knuckles like snow on bark. "She bled too much. I held her, told her to stay, told her the baby needed her, but she just smiled like she knew something I didn't, said his name should be Jonah." His voice cracked at the name. He let it sit there in the firelight. "She died before dawn." Jonah came out, breathing, barely. He was so small. I wrapped him in flannel and sat up with him for 2 days. He had her eyes. A pause, then softer. Second night, he stopped breathing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with memory, with the weight of snow that never melted. Clara set her mending aside and folded her hands in her lap. "I buried them both under the weeping pine," Elias continued. "Built that fence myself, marked the grave with a stone from the river, didn't speak to another soul for near on 20 winters after that." His eyes finally lifted, meeting Clara's. "Until you knocked." She didn't flinch under his gaze, didn't offer platitudes or tears. She simply nodded, slow and reverent, as if receiving the last page of a book too sacred to close. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words were small, but they rang clear in the quiet. Elias looked back at the fire, the lines in his face deepening with something like release. "I don't tell it for pity," he said. "I tell it so you know what this place holds, what I carry. I ain't a man who forgot how to love. I'm a man who remembers too well." Clara rose, crossed the short distance between them, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder, not to console, not to fix, just to be near. And for a moment, Elias Boone closed his eyes, not to escape, but to rest. In the warmth of shared sorrow, something ancient and broken began to shift, not healed, not yet, but moved, slightly, toward the light. The earth was hard, brittle as old bone, and stubborn with frost. Clara knelt beside it anyway, her skirts bunched around her knees, her fingers red with cold as she chipped away at the crust of frozen dirt just beyond the edge of the cabin. It wasn't spring, not by any measure. The snow had only just begun to pull back its grasp from the ridgeline, and patches of dead grass peeked through the white like moth-eaten cloth. But the sky had changed its tone just slightly, and the birds had returned to their quiet, cautious songs. Elias stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching her as if she were mad. "You won't get nothin' from that soil," he muttered. "It's rock and clay, frozen half the year. No sun hits that patch till near May. Clara glanced up, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. That's what men always say right before something blooms. He snorted, shaking his head, but he didn't walk away. Didn't return to the axe, or the workbench, or the long trails of solitude that had filled his days before her arrival. Instead, he stepped down the 3 porch steps and came to stand beside her, boots crunching softly against the patchy snow. Clara pressed her trowel deeper. It's not about what'll grow today. It's about making space. For when the thaw comes. She didn't say what she meant beyond that, but Elias heard it anyway. He crouched beside her, pulled off his gloves, and reached into the earth. It became their rhythm. In the mornings after breakfast, with Benjamin strapped warm against Clara's chest or napping inside the cabin, the 2 of them would dig. They marked a square with broken twine, cleared stones, turned soil. When the thaw deepened, they buried kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, eggshells, potato peels, letting the land remember how to nourish. Elias built a low fence from fallen branches. Clara smoothed the rows with her hands. They said little, but each action was a word in a conversation neither had spoken aloud. One morning, Elias brought out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and unrolled it on the cabin steps. Heirloom seeds he'd kept for decades, untouched since the year Jonah was meant to be born. Peas, squash, beans, even a faded packet of sunflowers. He held them out without a word. Clara took them like they were made of gold. Together, they planted hope. And in the planting, something shifted between them. He began asking about her favorite flowers. She told him marigolds, wild and bright, the kind that seemed to laugh in full Sunday. He told her he once carved a cradle from aspen wood with a sprig of lavender pressed into its bottom panel. He didn't say who it was for. He didn't have to. Clara began to laugh more quietly, then freely. Benjamin learned to crawl in the dirt near the edge of the garden, reaching for pebbles and worms with a giggle that made Elias pause in whatever he was doing, just to listen. One afternoon, while smoothing the soil around a row of onion bulbs, Clara looked up and said, "You know, a garden can't erase the past." Elias nodded slowly. "But it can feed the future." She smiled. "Exactly." That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Elias watched Clara and the child through the cabin window. She was rocking Benjamin, singing something soft and tuneless, her journal open on the table beside her. Outside, the ground still looked barren. But just beneath the surface, things were stirring. It would take time. It would take patience. But something was going to grow. The trapper came down the ridge at dusk, his coat stiff with ice and a musket slung across his shoulder. Elias met him near the edge of the wood, where the pines grew dense and the snow clung to the low branches like sagging lace. The 2 men spoke in hushed tones, voices low and clipped, and Clara watched from the cabin window, her hands frozen mid-motion as she shelled dried peas into a tin bowl. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw Elias go still, his shoulders tight, his face turned away from the fading light, as though even the sky might see too much. When the trapper left, Elias didn't come inside right away. He remained there in the half-shadow of the trees, staring into the valley below, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. Clara waited, her heart thudding like a warning bell in her chest. Finally, the door opened. He stepped in, brushing snow from his boots, his coat already half unbuttoned, the wind following him like a cold breath before he shut it out again. He didn't speak right away, but his eyes found hers across the room. The look in them was enough. She rose slowly, her hand drifting to Benjamin's cradle, instinct moving faster than thought. "Tell me," she said, voice steady, though the cold had nothing to do with the chill in her bones. Elias exhaled through his nose, the sound short and bitter. "There's talk in the valley. A man's been sending riders out, asking about a woman with a baby. Name's not given, but the description fits." Clara didn't blink. "He's found me." Elias nodded once. "He's not coming to plead," she said. It wasn't a question. It was memory. Knowledge soaked into her blood like poison. "He'll come with men, with papers, with claims." "Land baron," Elias said quietly, "owns half the freight wagons south of the bend, rich enough to hire law or break it." She closed her eyes. Her breath caught sharp in her throat, and her hands trembled, knuckles white against the bowl. "His name is Malcolm Redden. I was promised to him by my father, paid for like a mule. I never signed anything, never gave him a word that was mine, but he called it marriage." Elias said nothing. "I ran because he laid hands on Benjamin." Her voice broke then, but she pushed on. "Not just me, my boy." Elias walked to the stove and stirred the pot of beans without looking at her. "Trapper says the men been asking around Hollow Creek, offering coin for directions. Claims he's retrieving stolen property." Clara felt her knees go weak. "That's what we are to him." Elias turned then, and his eyes were not soft. They were dark with purpose. "You're not going anywhere. Not with him. Not with anyone." Her lips parted to speak, but he held up a hand. "This ridge ain't part of any township. No law rides up here unless I allow it. And if he tries, let him bring his men." He paused. "They'll learn the hills don't take kindly to trespassers." Clara's eyes stung, but she did not cry. Instead, she walked to Benjamin and lifted him into her arms, holding him close to her chest, her lips brushing his hair. "I won't run again," she whispered. "You won't have to," Elias answered. Outside, the moon rose pale and watchful over Echo Ridge, and somewhere far below, in the quiet, bitter heart of the valley, a shadow was stirring, rich, ruthless, and certain of its right to possess what it had never earned. But up here, in a cabin carved from sorrow and firewood, two people had begun to remember what it meant to stand and stay, and fight if they had to. Smoke rose black against the morning sky, a crooked column twisting above the treetops beyond Hollow Creek. By the time the first tongues of flame were spotted licking the rafters of the Granger family's old barn, it was already too late to save it. The dry wood caught fast, and the blaze spread furious, hurling sparks like curses into the gray dawn. Folks from the town gathered with buckets and blankets, but no one spoke as they watched it collapse in on itself with a groan like a dying animal. Rumors began before the ashes cooled. "Wasn't lightning," someone said. "No storm last night. Granger's boy saw riders, 3 of 'em. Didn't stop to water their horses. All dressed in black. Bounty hunters," whispered the butcher's wife. "Not the kind that wear stars." By noon, the word had spread like fire itself. The land baron from the valley, Malcolm Redden, had made good on his threats. Clara Bell's escape was not to be forgiven. Not by a man who bought everything he wanted, including silence. Not by a man whose pride was louder than his conscience. He had sent men not with warrants, but with matches. Warnings in flame. Maudie Ray heard the talk while collecting herbs outside the apothecary. She said nothing at first, just tied her bundle tighter and mounted her old mule with a frown deep enough to split stone. She didn't stop for lunch. Didn't wait for permission. By sundown, she was halfway up the ridge, snow crunching under her boots as she made the last stretch on foot. Elias Boone met her at the tree line, rifle across his back, coat lined with frost. He'd seen the smoke too, and he didn't look surprised. "I figured it'd be you," he said as she approached. "I figured you'd be too proud to ask." She shot back, her breath curling into the cold air. They stood a moment in the waning light, 2 weather-beaten souls, both too old for foolishness, but not yet too tired to fight. "I hear they're comin' with horses," Maudie said. "Men who don't knock, men who break doors and take what they're paid to fetch." Elias nodded once. "I know the kind. You can't face them alone." He looked past her, up toward the cabin, where the chimney smoked steady and warm. "I don't aim to let them near her." Maudie's eyes softened just a little. "And I don't aim to bury another friend because he thought a gun and grief were enough to stop evil. You forget I've delivered half this town's babies. That means most of them still listen when I raise my voice." "I don't want a war," he said. "Then you'd best be ready for one," she answered. "Because a man like Redden doesn't just come to reclaim. He comes to punish. He'll make a lesson out of her unless someone stops him." Elias's face was carved from stone, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear, not doubt, something heavier. Resolve settling into place like a foundation. "I won't let him touch her," he said again. Maudie reached out, placed a hand on his arm. "Then let us help you, Elias Boone. Let the town remember it still has a spine." He didn't speak, but he didn't pull away either, and that was answer enough. That night, as Maudie rode back down the ridge under a sky smeared with stars, Elias stood watch at the edge of the clearing. his rifle in hand, the shadows deep and shifting. And from the valley below, unseen but not unknown, the fire had already marked its path. They were coming, but they would not find fear waiting. Not this time. The church bell rang low and steady on Sunday morning, though the air was colder than most folks liked to face, without good reason. Snow clung stubbornly to the rooftops, and the streets of Hollow Creek were still dusted with soot from the Granger barn fire. But the people came anyway, boots crunching, shawls drawn tight, children bundled, and quiet. The pews filled slow, not with curiosity this time, but with something heavier, a silence of reckoning. Reverend Josiah Cole stood at the pulpit, Bible in one hand, his other resting on the wood like a steadying weight. He was not a man who strayed from Scripture. Folks knew his sermons as predictable judgment for the sinner, grace for the repentant, fire for the wicked. But that morning, when he began to speak, his voice didn't carry brimstone, it carried steel. "There comes a time," he said, "when the question isn't whether a man or woman is righteous, but whether they are safe, whether justice will defend them when cruelty comes wrapped in law, when money buys silence and fear robs a town of its memory." He paused, eyes sweeping across the congregation. "We all saw the fire. We know who set it, and we know who they ride for. Malcolm Redden is not just a man, he is a wound that festers every time we let him take what he wants." Murmurs stirred through the room. Some folks shifted uncomfortably, but others sat up straighter. "There's a woman on that ridge," the preacher continued. A widow, a mother. She asked for nothing but silence, safety, and a roof over her head. She found it not among us, but with a man we once called cursed, a man we judged from a distance. Elias Boone. A pause. Then, softer. "And yet it's him who stands watch with his rifle while we hide in our parlors and pray for distance." The hush deepened. A child coughed. The preacher closed his Bible gently. "This town's heart is not in its church, nor its schoolhouse, nor its ledgers. It's in what we do when evil comes riding. So I say to you, will we stand by, or will we stand up?" He stepped back, left the silence to decide. It didn't take long. Later that afternoon, the blacksmith pulled his old rifle from the back wall of his shop and began cleaning it, careful with every part. The schoolteacher hitched her father's mule and filled the wagon with blankets and bandages. 3 of the older boys, once prone to teasing and boasting, gathered in the stables to sharpen hatchets and stack spare lumber. Maudie Ray returned from the ridge with word that Elias had fortified the cabin. She handed out maps marked with trails and narrow passes. She instructed the men where to post up high and the women where to take shelter if things turned. No one laughed. No one mocked. In the general store, folks gathered supplies without being asked: jerky, cartridges, oil for lanterns. Even Jeremiah Lorne, the saloon keeper who once spat Clara's name like a curse, said nothing when he placed 2 bottles of whiskey and a tin of biscuits in the hands of a rider headed north. Something old was stirring in Hollow Creek. Not rage, not revenge, conscience. And under the pale sky that evening, as fires were lit and hands were shaken, a single truth echoed louder than any sermon. They would not let evil come quietly. Not this time. The sun crested low behind Echo Ridge, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted clearing in front of the cabin. The sky was the color of hammered pewter, and the air carried a sharpness that bit at the lungs. But there was no wind, no bird song, just a stillness so deep it felt unnatural, like the world was waiting to see what would happen next. They came just past midday, 3 riders on black horses, their coats too fine for true labor, their eyes hard from too many towns like Hollow Creek, folding under their boots. One of them, the lead, wore a red scarf at his throat and a silver star pinned to his vest, not a marshal's badge, but something bought in a place where money turned lies into law. The others flanked him like wolves, their pistols polished, their grins mean. Elias was already outside when they arrived, standing at the front steps of the cabin, rifle across his arms, face unreadable. He didn't raise the gun. He didn't speak. He just waited. Clara stepped out beside him. She wore a plain wool dress and held Benjamin close in a sling across her chest. The child's tiny hand curled into her shawl. Her chin was lifted, her eyes steady. The bruise on her cheek had long since faded, but what lived behind her gaze hadn't. The lead rider pulled his horse to a halt, letting the snow spray beneath its hooves. He produced a folded paper and waved it like a flag. "Got a writ here," he said, loud and smug. "Signed by a judge down in Clayton. Says the woman and child belong to Malcolm Redden. Says they were taken unlawfully." Elias didn't move. "That's so," the man smiled. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're taking the woman and the boy. You step aside, and maybe I don't write your name on the same page." Clara's grip on Benjamin tightened, but she didn't flinch. Elias didn't blink. "She's not property," he said, "and that paper's not worth the ash it's printed on." Behind them, the trees shifted. Hooves crunched. The bounty hunters turned their heads. From the slope came the unmistakable sound of wagons, boots, and breath. Maudie Ray rode at the front, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, her eyes sharp as frost. Behind her came 10 more men and women, both armed, not with vengeance, but with conviction. The blacksmith with his rifle, the schoolteacher with a kitchen knife tied to a stick, even Jeremiah Lorne, jaw clenched tight, carrying a rusted double barrel like it was sacred. The bounty hunters weren't expecting a crowd. "Town's not your concern," one of them barked. Maudie rode closer. "This ridge is part of the mountain, and the mountain's part of us. You threaten me, old woman." She leaned in, voice low. "I remind you, that woman ran from harm. She came here seeking refuge, and if you think Hollow Creek will stand by while you drag her and that baby back to hell, then you ain't met Hollow Creek." The lead rider's grin faltered. Elias took one step forward, shifting the rifle in his hands, not raising it, just showing that he could. "Turn around." The standoff hung there, frozen in time. Guns weren't drawn yet, but hands were close, hearts pounded. The mountains watched. The bounty hunter looked again at the paper in his hand, then at the woman, then at the crowd. For the first time, he saw not a cabin in the hills, but a wall he couldn't breach, not with bullets, not with lies. He spat into the snow. "You'll regret this." Elias stepped down onto the path. "Try me." They turned. The horses wheeled. The paper flapped in the wind, and the men rode off the ridge the way they came, fast, cold, and empty-handed. No one cheered. They didn't need to, because the line had been drawn, and for once it had held. The bounty hunters hadn't made it far down the ridge when Elias called out after them, his voice cutting through the cold like the crack of a whip. "You left something." They reined their horses hard, surprised, suspicious. The lead rider turned just enough to glance over his shoulder, lip curled. Clara stepped forward then, past Elias, past the crowd that had gathered behind her. Her shawl flapped lightly in the breeze, and her arms cradled not Benjamin this time, but a folded letter, sealed in wax, worn thin from handling. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she held it up. "This is the truth," she said. The rider narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to be?" "A letter from Judge Abernathy," Clara answered, "dated 2 years ago. It states clearly that Malcolm Redden never filed a lawful marriage license, that the signature on the supposed contract of union between us was forged, my father's and mine." Laughter, sharp and bitter, broke from the bounty hunter's throat. "You expect me to take a woman's word on a piece of paper she kept tucked in her dress?" "I don't," Clara said. Her voice was steady now, louder. "But he might." From the crowd, a man stepped forward, tall, spare-framed, wrapped in a wool coat, and a quiet authority that made space around him without asking. His white beard was trimmed neat, his boots polished, a silver ring gleamed on his right hand, and in his left he held a seal identical to the one pressed onto Clara's letter. "I'm Judge Emery Bellwether," the man said simply. "Circuit Court, appointed by the governor of this territory. I was in Hollow Creek this week on unrelated business, but now I'm here, and I'm confirming, as an officer of the law, that the letter she holds is legitimate. I witnessed the original complaint. I signed the ruling myself." The bounty hunter froze. Judge Bellwether took the letter from Clara's hands, opened it carefully, and read aloud, "The court finds no evidence of a legal union between Mr. Malcolm Redden and Miss Clara Bell. The claim of marriage is null. Any attempts to reclaim the woman or her child under the pretense of spousal rights shall be considered unlawful and punishable under state and federal statutes." He folded the paper again and turned to the riders. "If you proceed," he said calmly, "you won't be bounty hunters, you'll be kidnappers." The men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Their confidence bled away with the wind. "Redden will hear about this," the leader muttered, though his voice held less threat than before. "I hope he does," Bellwether replied. It's time the law heard more about him. They didn't argue. Not anymore. They turned and rode off, hooves thudding like distant thunder, their pride tucked under their coats. Clara exhaled. It was not a cheer that followed. This was not the end of a war, but the end of something smaller, quieter, and no less cruel. The power that had once chased her through towns and up a mountain had collapsed not with violence, but with the truth. Ink had done what fists and fire could not. Maudie Ray stepped beside her and placed a steady hand on her arm. "You did it." Clara looked at Benjamin, nestled now in Elias's arms, then at the crowd that had come not just to witness, but to stand. "No," she said, "we did." And far below in the valley, though he did not yet know it, Malcolm Redden had lost more than a claim. He had lost his shadow. Rain came hard that night, breaking the long spell of snow and silence that had clung to Echo Ridge like a second skin. Thunder rolled down from the mountains, echoing through the valleys in slow, grumbling waves, as if the land itself were finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The smoke from the cabin chimney twisted into the dark sky, and inside, the fire burned low while Clara sat beside Elias, her fingers woven into his, her eyes refusing to close. He hadn't stirred in 3 days. The wound had been deep, a cruel gash just above his ribs, torn open during the standoff, when one of Redden's men, one too slow to surrender, had drawn steel instead of retreating. Elias had moved without hesitation, shielding Clara with his own body before the shot rang out. He'd felled the man with a single blow, then dropped to his knees like a tree cut at the root. The others fled after that, and by the time the law arrived, real law, not the kind bought with gold and silence, there was no fight left to give. Malcolm Redden had been arrested at his estate in the valley 2 days later. Judge Bellwether had traveled with the sheriff himself, presenting forged deeds, false marriage claims, and a long list of coerced signatures. The land he'd tried to claim, the land around Echo Ridge, was ruled sovereign, untouchable by his reach. For the first time in a generation, the ridge belonged to no man. It belonged to its people, and the people had chosen to protect it. But Elias hadn't woken. Clara stayed with him through every hour. She bathed his brow, changed his bandages, whispered words he couldn't hear. She fed Benjamin with one arm and held Elias's hand with the other, singing lullabies not just for the child, but for the man who had saved them both. Outside, the garden waited for spring. The goats huddled in the shed, quiet and safe. The townsfolk came in turns, bringing broth, candles, fresh herbs, but Clara barely noticed them. Her world had narrowed to the steady rise and fall of Elias's chest, to the faint color in his cheeks, to the pulse she prayed would not falter. On the third morning, as the rain began to thin and the first shy light crept across the ridge, Elias's fingers twitched. Clara gasped, nearly dropping the basin she was holding. She leaned in, heart stammering, eyes wide as his lids fluttered once, then again. When he finally looked at her, it was like watching a fire catch from dying embers. "You stayed," he rasped, voice hoarse from days of silence. "I did," she whispered, brushing her fingers gently through his hair. He tried to speak again, but she placed a hand on his chest. "Later, just rest." But his eyes caught something, then the journal on the table beside the bed, left open, pages worn and creased. He looked at her, and she gave the faintest nod. He turned his gaze to the page. "I was never looking for a man. I was looking for peace." His breath caught, and for the first time since she'd known him, tears filled his eyes, not from pain, but from something far more fragile. "I didn't know peace could knock," he murmured. Clara leaned close, pressing her forehead gently to his. "Neither did I," she said, and outside, the last rumble of thunder rolled away, leaving behind only the soft patter of rain and the quiet, undeniable sound of healing beginning. The snow melted in ribbons, retreating into the hollows first, then the shaded edges of the ridge. By the time the crocuses bloomed, small and stubborn along the garden's edge, it was clear. Winter had finally loosened its grip. The soil, once frozen and cracked, had softened under the coaxing of Clara's hands. She moved through the garden in the early hours, sleeves rolled and cheeks flushed, checking sprouts with the care of a mother, pea shoots, onion greens, basil nudging its way toward the Sunday. Life had returned, not all at once, but in tender steps. Word spread through Hollow Creek that something was growing up on Echo Ridge, and not just vegetables. The women came first, not in groups, but one by one, shy and uncertain. Clara welcomed them with warm bread, a place at the table, and a spade in hand. She showed them how to tell the difference between wild mint and creeping ivy, how to dry lavender for tea, how to press marigold petals between the pages of books to carry summer into winter. They stayed longer each time. Some brought their children, who scrambled across the clearing with muddy boots and unbrushed hair, chasing goats and laughter. The goats, once skittish, had grown fat and docile. Benjamin learned to walk among them, toddling between clumps of thyme with arms outstretched for balance and eyes wide at every flutter of wings or twitch of ears. Elias carved again. He sat on the porch, a block of cedar in his hands and a knife glinting in the afternoon light. His fingers worked slow and precise, shaping tiny animals, delicate flowers, the curved legs of chairs, and the curved backs of toys. One morning, he finished a cradle small, smooth, sturdy. He set it gently inside the cabin, and though no child would sleep in it that season, it stood as a symbol of something beginning. Clara watched him sometimes through the open window, brushing flour from her hands as she kneaded dough. He didn't speak often, not more than he needed to, but he smiled more now. At the children, at the goats, at her. It was a quiet smile, the kind that came with a deep breath and the settling of old ghosts. The preacher's wife came, once, bringing a jar of honey and a basket of linens. She didn't apologize for the things she'd once said didn't need to. She knelt beside Clara in the garden and asked, simply, what soil was best for sage? And that was enough. The cabin no longer stood in solitude. It stood in welcome. Someone had painted a sign near the trailhead, no words, just a carved pine branch and a crescent moon. Folks began calling it the Hollow Garden, not formally, but with familiarity. A place where bruises healed in the sun, where silence wasn't loneliness, where children learned how to press seeds into dirt and believe something would come of it. Peace had settled into the bones of the place, not as a visitor, but as a resident. And on some afternoons, when the breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and rosemary, when Benjamin laughed loud enough to echo through the trees, and when Elias Boone looked up from his carving to meet Clara's eyes, there was no mistaking it. What they had built was no longer just survival. It was home. The morning was clear, the kind of spring day that felt like it had been earned, not given. The sun spilled gently across Echo Ridge, warming the tops of the budding trees and catching in the folds of Clara's dress as she stood beneath the weeping pine. The great branches swayed lightly above her, their long green tendrils shifting in the breeze like slow blessings. There were no ribbons, no pews, no music but the rustle of leaves and the murmur of wind. Just the tree, the earth, and the man standing before her, with his hands folded and his heart uncovered. Elias Boone wore a clean shirt, a plain vest, and an expression that was not unfamiliar, but somehow new. His beard had been trimmed, his hair combed back with care, but it wasn't the grooming that made the difference. It was the light in his eyes, the peace that had settled where sorrow once made its bed. His gaze met Clara's not with fear or apology, but with quiet reverence, as though he still couldn't quite believe that she had come, and stayed, and forgiven him the years he had lost to grief. Benjamin stood at Clara's side, his tiny boots dusty from the walk up the ridge, his hand curled around hers. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he smiled anyway, because everyone else was smiling, and the world felt full. Maudie Ray stood between them with a worn leather book in her hands and a warmth in her voice that wrapped around the gathering like a shawl. Behind her, townsfolk watched in respectful silence, just a few, not a crowd. The preacher and his wife, the blacksmith, the schoolteacher. A dozen others, who had once looked up at this cabin with suspicion, now gathered here not to judge, but to witness. There were no vows read from a script, only words spoken from the heart. Clara's voice was steady, her fingers trembling only slightly as she reached for Elias's hand. "I came here running," she said, "not to find love, not even to find safety, but I found something I thought was gone from the world, kindness, and in that kindness I found you." Elias cleared his throat, the words slow to come but true when they did. "I thought I'd buried everything that mattered under this tree. I thought life had ended the day I lost them. But the day you knocked, something opened. Not just the door, not just the cabin." His voice cracked, and he swallowed. "You opened my heart, Clara Bell, and gave me a reason to live again." Maudie nodded, tearful but beaming, and spoke the final words with a voice that rang like gospel. "Then, by the power of love and the truth of second chances, I pronounce you husband and wife." They didn't kiss right away. They simply held each other's gaze. And then they reached for Benjamin, lifting him between them as he laughed and threw his arms around their necks, too young to know what it meant but old enough to feel that he belonged. Later, they walked back to the cabin as a family. The garden waited. The goats bleated in greeting. The sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts. No one sang, no one danced. But joy was everywhere in the footsteps, in the earth, in the shared glances of a town that had once forgotten how to love its own and had now remembered. And as the wind curled through the pine branches above the grave where Elias had once buried his sorrow, the narrator's voice lingered soft across the ridge. She knocked at his door and knocked open his heart. And for the first time in 20 years, Elias Boone's cabin wasn't just a shelter in the wilderness. It was home. It was family. It was whole.